Human rights violations, egregious violations of human rights have become largely synonymous with Awami rule, particularly
During the Awami League rule, there was a lot of contention about extrajudicial killings.
very conservative estimate that at least 708 people were forcibly disappeared under Awami League's 15-year rule.
We're incredibly humbled to have you today for this interview for the Human Rights Day to be celebrated on the 10th of December. So I have a few questions for you, Taqbir, if you don't mind answering.
Thank you so much for having me, and of course, looking forward to the discussion.
One topic that's been extremely not sidelined but not given its due gravitas is human rights. How significant of a role did the violation of human rights play in the eventual expulsion of the fascist Awami League regime?
Well, human rights violations, egregious violations of human rights have become largely synonymous with Awami rule, particularly in the past decade. And as human rights defenders, we felt quite frustrated that no matter whatever new heights of human rights violations and authoritarianism that the government reached, it seemed to be able to operate with a level of impunity. So I guess really it's the scale of the violations that were committed during the July Revolution, which I think was quite unprecedented, right? I mean, it's possibly the deadliest I mean, it's certainly the deadliest protest in our history, but it's possibly also the deadliest protest this year around the world. So I suppose the very short span in which the amount of civilian deaths that we witnessed and the tender age of the protesters who were being killed, and then combined with the unprecedented total communications shutdown, the shoot on site curfew order, and the horrific imagery and videos that showed security forces using absolutely brutal force against unarmed protesters. I guess that is what really shook the conscience of the international community. But at the end of the day, human rights is only as good as the power of those who care about it. So, like human rights, like the best leverage that human rights has is its ability to stigmatize perpetrators and the informational politics that human rights defenders can be privy to. So, I guess it really ultimately boils down to those who had the power to do something about Awami League's rule finally decided to pay attention to the level, unprecedented scale of its violations. So I guess ultimately, victory could only be attributed to the sheer the determination of the student-led movement and the student-led, campaign to remove Awami League. And I guess human rights played an important informational or at the level of discourse, it played an important role in sort of characterizing the enemy.
So you mentioned several human rights violations in informing us about what led to the ouster of the Awami League. Um, what were the most rampant of them, aside of what happened during the July uprising? Because during the Awami League rule, there was a lot of contention about extrajudicial killings and enforced disappearances.
Yes, of course. I mean, these two, I think most would agree, were the most egregious violations that became incredibly common under Awami League's rule, particularly the way it instrumentalized these two forms of violations, right? So we know from a very conservative estimate that at least 708 people were forcibly disappeared under Awami League's 15-year rule. What Human Rights Watch called the decade of disappearance. We know that thousands were killed in extrajudicial executions, and we know how it happened, right? So most of the time it happened under the garb of the war on drugs, war against terrorism, various labels to justify. So, victims often told us that like death is better than disappearance, because at least when your loved one is dead, you can start mourning. So that's what the thousands of families impacted by this systematic use of enforced disappearances would tell you. So that the infliction of sheer trauma on those who posed a threat to the Awami League was really characteristic of its rule. But at the same time, the use of extrajudicial executions was just as horrific. And you had, it became a common saying to say that, if you're lucky, you get jailed, but if you're unlucky, you get disappeared or killed. So I guess that encapsulates what it was like to live under the Awami League rule.
So, within this bleak imagery that you've drawn for us, what systematic vulnerabilities do you think allowed for the failure to protect human rights in Bangladesh to the extent that it did for the past 15 years?
Right. So just I forgot to add to the previous question is, of course, the systematic suppression of dissent was the overarching theme under which all these violations took place. So again, just the way that like the freedom of expression was completely eradicated through the use of legal machinery. And this is where the systemic or the vulnerabilities come into play, right? Like the Army League didn't just go and throw people in jail without any resort to the language of the law. They did what they did very much through the garb of legal justification. I guess the systematic vulnerabilities that I would sort of really focus on is our essentially colonial criminal laws, right? So the authoritarian laws and procedures that our colonizers used to oppress us, to subjugate us, was then inherited by the post-colonial state. And not only did it just inherit it, it sort of used that as a blueprint to continue to expand its penal powers. And to make this a bit more tangible, what I mean is the power of the police to arrest individuals without warrant, to search them without warrant, to seize their devices without warrant, to deny them bail once they have been, arrested, and then, leading to lengthy pretrial detention. I mean, we don't have up-to-date jail statistics, but the latest one suggests that 80% of Bangladesh's prison population are actually victims of pretrial detention. So they have not even been convicted of any crime. They are in prison because like the police arrested them and threw them in jail. And of course, then lies the very rampant use of the most severe penalties in law, which is the life imprisonment or a death penalty. So when you combine these sweeping punitive powers of the state, which it inherited and then expanded from our colonial oppressors, what you have is essentially a form of neocolonialism through the use of the carceral machine of the state. But we find it difficult to sort of conceptualize it as such, because sadly we as individuals also have a very punitive legal consciousness, right? We equate justice with punitive responses by the state. We equate justice with the death penalty. So when we see the state exhibiting such high levels of punitive powers, we don't really stop to question why that is the form of justice that must be delivered by the state.
From the information that you've imparted with us, we can draw a few conclusions that the law enforcement as well as the judiciary were severely crippled in their actual responsibilities to protect our population, and instead they were serving a higher purpose on a governmental level. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean, no branch of state had independence, right? So some scholars have sort of labeled Bangladesh as a party, like they said, there's a party police nexus. So what really happened under the Awami League is absolute infiltration of party loyalists or partisan recruitments within the police. And then we don't have an independent prosecutorial system. So prosecutors are also ad hoc political appointments. And then we've heard similar concerns about, judicial appointments, and Bangladesh, went like tanked in rule of law index ratings. So then you have the police, the prosecution, and the judiciary. If they're acting at the whims of the then ruling party, then what is the justice system going to be other than an instrument of harassment at the beck and call of the ruling party? And the sad thing is, Awami League may have gone, but these colonial laws, these expansive punitive powers of the state, these infrastructural deficiencies within the criminal justice system or the legal system more broadly, they remain, and they are sadly not a point of our conversation. Awami League was a problem, but it made use of an legal machinery, an oppressive legal machinery that pre-existed it, that successive governments in Bangladesh have made use of. So if we really want to be emancipated from this level of subjugation, what needs to happen is not just the ouster of a fascist regime. We also need to ouster the fascist or authoritarian legal system that has been culminated, over the past few decades.
So, Takbir, as a human rights worker, do you feel that in a lot of scenarios, human rights workers are rendered as mere political pawns?
First and foremost, I would obviously, on the occasion of the Human Rights Day, I would salute the human rights defenders who remained on the front line, risking their lives, risking their, like so much more of being, the first to sort of speak truth to power. Here, we may be reminded of Mr. Mushtaq Ahmed, who was, essentially tortured to death. So individuals like him, the symbols of bravery, who we have so much to learn from. I mean, rather than political pawns, I would say they were sort of given a clear message that there's a small set of issues that do not threaten the state's interests that you can work on as human rights. So, apolitical issues, which, I mean, not apolitical per se, but issues where the violators are primarily non-state actors. So those are the issues that the Awami League allowed human rights defenders to work on, and other issues where state complicity or state perpetration of human rights violations became very apparent, such as extrajudicial killings or enforced disappearances. The message was clear that if you worked on those issues, we will, defund your organization, we will deregister your organization, we will freeze your assets, we will ensure that you receive no foreign funding, because we will not, like the NGO Affairs Bureau was instrumentalized as a vetting mechanism that, NGOs, because by and large, our NGOs are foreign funded, they receive money from, donors abroad, and they sort of vetted which issues we will allow NGOs to work on and which they will not be able to work on. So it was a choice between working on real issues on human rights or surviving as an entity. Most NGOs chose the latter as a survival mechanism. Those who sought to, do the unthinkable suffered the consequences, right? We don't need to look further than Odhikar and what happened to it as an entity and what happened to its leaders. So that sent a very chilling message. You would be hard pressed to find Bangladeshi human rights organizations which worked on extrajudicial executions or enforced disappearances, um, other than Odhikar and other than also maybe Aino Shalish Kendra, which provided some statistics, but then it also faced repercussions for doing so.
So, just to elaborate a little more on what you just said, what approach do you believe would be most effective in addressing human rights violations in Bangladesh? And if I could further ask for the scope, do you think reparative responses such as compensation and rehabilitation for victims should take precedence over punitive measures, or should both be integrated? And is it infrastructurally possible for our country to float such reforms?
Well, so I'll answer in two bits. So the first bit about what could be done. So institutionally, I think we need to, you know, introduce an independent and impartial prosecutorial system. I think that was on the agenda during the last caretaker government, and interestingly, Awami League also had it in its last fifth 5-year plan. So it's something that comes up every now and then, but it just fizzles out, and I think we shouldn't allow it to fizzle out this time around. We should really undo the partisan infiltration of the police force that took place, and we should really remove these sweeping punitive powers of arrest, denial of bail, and pretrial detention that punitive institutions have in Bangladesh through reform, extensive reform of the colonial um, uh, um, criminal codes and laws and special penal laws. But also, in terms of substantive law, we know that none of the oppressive laws have actually yet been reformed. Like, we still have the Cybersecurity Act. We still see some reports of people being, sued under that law. And finally, what I mentioned before, that we as people have a very punitive legal consciousness. We need to understand that justice can also take a more reparative form, right? Victims of human rights violations, more often than not, actually need a right to reparation, which is largely non-existent in our context. Victims seldom, if ever, receive compensation from the state or from the wrongdoer. We have a draft Crime Victims Compensation Act, which was proposed by the Law Commission in 2007. It's been 17 years. It's still a draft, and there's been no political uptake. So we need to conceptualize the state as being the primary duty bearer, right? So if it has failed to respect human rights, if it has failed to ensure that human rights are not violated, it owes a primary obligation to compensate those victims of violations. And here, you could conceptualize such pecuniary or monetary liability serving a deterrent function. And in regards to punitive responses, we need to understand that the state does not have free rein in imposing whatever punishment it wishes to impose. Even those subject to the criminal punishment or justice process have human rights. They have the right to a fair trial. So I guess we would be remiss if we did not mention that many of the people who have been arrested and who are currently facing trial for the massacres or atrocities that took place in the July Revolution are also facing a great deal of fair trial violations, right? We've seen them come under attack in court. We've seen them being arrested, perhaps without warrants, perhaps on, charges that are legally dubious, right? Like individuals who did not necessarily have the actus reus of the crime, which is the physical component of a crime, that you must be physically committing the crime that you're accused of. Like individuals who had no actus reus being picked up for offenses like murder and whatnot. These are not really reflective of a change. Rather, it sort of reflects a continuation of the pattern that we've seen even under the Awami League, that you could use the legal system and come up with trumped up charges to, target individuals, not for what they've done, but for their affiliations.
So we do see systematic changes in Bangladesh's human rights governance framework. On the 20th of November, our chief advisor mentioned that he wants to amend the Human Rights Commission Act 2009 and make an amendment to it, which would include transparency, inclusivity, and gender sensitivity. What is your opinion about the Human Rights Commission?
So the National Human Rights Commission was largely irrelevant in the course of my human rights work on Bangladesh. We knew it existed. As Dr. Shadhin Malik once said, it became the retirement home for certain government bureaucrats, right? If you look at the appointments of those who were chosen, one thing it used to do um, in early days was publish at least some reports, and then it sort of stopped doing that too. I'm honestly like, it's hard to say what utility the NHRC could have unless it's clear what kind of reform is being proposed. But I mean, they did like, at the very least, they could be someone, they could be an entity that sort of documents human rights violations in Bangladesh in a more tangible manner. We don't have human rights statistics other than those that are published by certain NGOs, and even those are methodologically dubious because they rely on newspaper incidents, which is not really the most reliable source of information. So I guess um, if it were to sort of adopt a robust methodology in sort of enumerating human rights violations occurring in Bangladesh, that would really sort of provide an opportunity for international human rights organizations which work on Bangladesh, such as Amnesty or Human Rights Watch or Civicas, to sort of have a channel through which they could, document human rights or collaborate perhaps to monitor human rights violations. So I guess I see an NHRC that does not have any formal investigative or executive powers. The best thing it can do is to serve as a watchdog, and the best thing you can do as a watchdog is have a robust methodology through which you sort of document human rights violations that are occurring. But if you, like, since its establishment in 2009, in the past 15 years, one would be hard pressed to find any valuable contribution by the NHRC in that regard, um, other than it in its very early years. But so it's been very few and far between.
Thank you very much, Taqbir, for your time.